Hello everybody, welcome back. And for those seeing the video for the first time, this is our third video in an 8-part series on the Charity Investment Governance Principles. So these principles are a set of principles that have been put together by charities, and they were led by a steering group that consisted of the Charity Finance Group, NCVO, WCVA, the ACF, and the Charities Responsible Investment Network. The project was funded by a group of philanthropic foundations, and these principles focus on practice in England and Wales and the regulatory requirements there, though hopefully they'll be useful a bit further afield as well. So if you haven't watched our first or second video yet, then please head to broadstone.co.uk and you can have a look at the first ones, and you can subscribe to the series so you get notifications when the next episodes are released. So today, Gail, we're going to be exploring the principle that focuses on leadership. So, Gail, what do we mean by leadership here?
Absolutely. So we start off with looking, obviously, the board, the trustee board, or whatever term your charity uses, for your group of trustees. They are the leaders of the charity. Obviously, for a number of charities, you'll have lots of staff members. You might have a very big staff team, and they provide a lot of leadership as well. But what we're focusing on here in governance terms is the leadership that the board provide and how they provide that leadership on investments. And particularly because investments isn't a topic that necessarily all of the trustees will have investment expertise. In fact, it's highly unlikely that all of them will have investment expertise. So how do you put together a strong governance structure and a delegation framework that really works for your charity? And so some of the key outcomes that we're looking at in this principle is making sure that all trustees understand their duties in relation to investments. They understand what they're meant to know and what they can delegate. Making sure those structures and mechanisms are in place, and also recognizing that it will reflect the size and complexity of what the charity holds. If your charity just has money held in cash, or it's got a very small investment portfolio, you won't need anywhere near as complicated investment governance structures as you might if you've got a really large or complicated investment portfolio. And finally, what does a good delegation framework look like?
Yeah, and it's that collective responsibility, I guess, for charity investments. So in this principle, you obviously talk about other delegation frameworks, and I would like it if maybe you could focus a bit on the charity's strategic approach to investments and looking at that wider input.
Yeah, absolutely. Because for most charities, unless they're just holding cash in a bank account, once you start getting more complicated investment portfolios, you're naturally going to have external resources, external investment advisors, external investment managers who are helping you with those. And so you need to really think about how all of that fits together. To tell a little story that came up in some focus groups we were doing and some of the chats I had with charities on the way through, one charity said to me, they said, oh, well, no one on our board has any investment expertise and we don't have an investment committee. All of our governance is done by our external paid for investment managers. And I must admit, I went, oh, goodness me, that doesn't feel quite right. Because, of course, the governance is the responsibility of the trustees. And I should emphasize that this was a very, very large endowed organisation that really should have more complex governance structures in place. And so what this principle is looking at is, what are the roles for all trustees? And don't worry, they're not hugely onerous, but making sure trustees are all meeting those trustee duties. Where might you need to have an investment committee or some kind of finance and investment committee that's looking at that within the board and maybe made up of board members and externally recruited volunteers? And then also, where are you working with external paid for help, be that investment advisors, investment managers, and so on? And who makes the different decisions? What decisions can be made by the external paid for sources, and what things are being decided internally?
And I think so that bit is a really important point, isn't it? Just that understanding and that understanding of who's going to be making those decisions. I think in the first point of this principle, you talk about trustee duties and particularly what the Charity Commission expects. So from that, what is it that you would encourage trustees to focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, the first point looks at that, and I would really encourage trustees to click through that principle onto the CC14 guidance and get a sense of, what the expectations are there. But also this principle explores, so it looks at governance structures, the range of skills that you might need depending on the type of investments that your charity holds. And obviously for smaller charities, that's going to be a lot less onerous than for larger charities. Looking at making sure it's commensurate with the complexity of the investments that are held. And so it's looking at, if you've just got investments in a bank account, what type of oversight might you need? Is it just that you've got a minimum of 2 individuals from the trustee board who are overseeing that? Where you've got investments beyond a bank account, what might you need? And then also if you've got really substantial or complex investments, what might you need? And then it also sets out a delegation framework. And again, just to emphasize, we are very keen to get feedback. There's a big provide feedback button on the website. So if your charity has a really good delegation framework, that's a really good example that we could be using, please do send that through, and we can obviously include that in the phase 2 of the project.
Yeah, that's a really important point, isn't it? This feedback is going to help ensure that these principles have got a lot of longevity and take into consideration information that gets shared from people using them. Well, for me, as an investment advisor at Broadstone, we have a key focus on advising smaller charities and giving access to that independent investment advice for those smaller charities. So would you mind maybe just focusing a little bit on what investment beyond the bank account might be for those who haven't yet taken the opportunity to explore this option?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously it's always interesting using the term smaller and larger charities. And as you're of course really aware, it can mean so many different things to different people. Of the 170,000 charities in England and Wales, the vast majority will have well under £1 million, and the vast majority will have, a small amount of money, maybe hundreds of pounds or a few £1,000s in a bank account, and that will be enough for them. And they could look at that smaller charities resource, which I should give a shout out at this point to the ICAEW, which is the Chartered Accountants Group for England and Wales. Their charities group did some really brilliant work helping us with that, making sure it was really appropriate. That document does look at what point you might want to look beyond a bank account. So if you're holding much larger amounts of cash, or you're holding cash for a really long time, and that's where you might want to start using expertise if you're a smaller charity. Obviously, there are a lot of kind of smaller charities in the sense of those charities that may be holding between £500,000 and a few £1 million, which I know for a lot of charities, they'll say that's not small, that's big. But just if we're thinking of those kind of charities in that bracket, the 500,000 to kind of 3 or 4 million type charities, they might want to really be exploring some more complicated things that aren't just holding cash, and they will want to look at the principles, but they might also want to look at, well, what are those external sources of guidance? There is some options explored in principle number 4 that I know we're going to come on to in a later video. But that also provides some suggestions of how you can compare the different options. What does an investment advisor do for you? What does an investment manager do for you? Where are the sources you can go to for independent advice?
Yeah, and those smaller charities, sometimes it's actually about seeking the information that hopefully has already been explored by many other charities in that position. So given there's a lot of talk about delegation in this leadership principle specifically, maybe you could just share a little bit of experience or what good practice for delegation might look like, what pitfalls to watch out for when delegating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the main things is to say that the delegation framework should be created by trustees with support from staff or committee members. Now, obviously in practice, and we've all seen it, it may well be that a staff member who's got some expertise or committee members and so on really help with some of the drafting of that. But the idea is that all trustees should have ownership of that delegation framework and should really understand who is taking decisions and why those decisions are being taken at different levels and so on. And revisiting that at appropriate intervals. And we do look in the examples and explain this, what an appropriate interval might be. We don't just stick it out there. But really reviewing that framework from time to time, making sure it's still got an appropriate level of control, depending on what size the charity's investments are or how complex they are, and so on, is, I think, really important. And then it's also making sure that there's a reporting structure in place. So it's great to know you've got a delegation framework and you know who's making those decisions, but actually, how are those decisions being fed back through to make sure that the board can have responsibility and oversight for the investment that's in line with their trustee duties.
Amazing. Okay, so I think that we've given everybody a lot to think about here. So thanks again for taking your time and sharing and discussing this one with me. Ahead of the next episode, it'd be great if anyone watching could have a look at the CIGP.org.uk and you could have a look at how you might be looking to implement these principles to your board. Our next episode is going to move on and we're going to be looking at the third principle, which focuses on integrity.